Good morning, everyone. As you're joining, I know people are filtering into the room now. Thank you for being with us. We're going to give folks just a minute. I know people are trickling in from the waiting room. Thank you for being here, everyone. All right, as folks continue to come in, good morning or afternoon, if it just turned afternoon where you are. Thank you all for being here. I'm Kyler Blodgett, State and Local Policy Analyst with PeopleForBikes, and I'm so glad that you all decided to join us for our February segment in our monthly industry webinar series. This month's conversation will be about leveraging the infrastructure bill passed in November for all things bikes. We have three fantastic panelists with us who you'll meet in just a second. I wanted to remind everyone that you're welcome to take notes, of course, but we will be sending out the recording and a copy of the slide deck for everyone who registered for this conversation shortly after the call. We'll be together for about 30 minutes. The first 20 will be a presentation from our three panelists, and the final 10 will be a virtual Q&A. So please make sure to use Zoom's Q&A feature throughout the call as you have questions so that our panelists can be ready once we get to that final portion. And now for our panelists. We have three fantastic guests from PeopleForBikes and the Rails-to-Trails Conservancy. First, Patrick Woyhan, and I'm sorry, I'm sorry if I'm making a mistake there. A close
that was great. Thanks, Tyler.
Thank you. A close partner of PeopleForBikes with the Rails-to-Trails Conservancy and an infrastructure policy expert. We have secondarily Noah Bunayan, our Director of Federal Affairs at PeopleForBikes, and Ashley Seward, Deputy Director of State and Local Policy at PeopleForBikes. So covering lots of different bases, and I'll pass it now to the presenters to lead us through today's content.
Thanks, Kyler, and welcome everyone. Our agenda for today is pretty straightforward. We'll give a high-level overview of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, whatever you want to call it. Patrick will lead us through some of the different buckets that are really exciting for active transportation funding and what we're focusing on most in the advocacy space to leverage for bikes and bike projects. I'll talk a little bit more about, the broader bike eligible programs for within the infrastructure bill and other opportunities sort of on the edges, with bridges and e-bikes and EV charging, things like that. And Ashley will take us through what you can do to get, be involved in the advocacy space to get these funds working for your community and how you can find additional resources from PeopleForBikes. And Patrick will share a little bit about, Rails-to-Trails Conservancy's resources too, that are for all of your using and viewing pleasure. And we'll, of course, open it up at the end for a question and answer session. Awesome. So what does the infrastructure bill mean for bikes? We're talking about a $1.2 trillion overall bill that includes a $550 billion transportation authorization. So many of you might be familiar or heard of the FAST Act. We finally now have a reauthorization of transportation policy within that $550 billion instead of continued extensions of the FAST Act. This provides a new funding for and focus on active modes, which is really critical. There's a precedent here that's being set that active transportation isn't alternative, it's critical, and that's why we're seeing a significant increase in funding within this large bill for active modes, with big emphases on safety, equity, climate, and network connectivity. And all this money, it's flowing, it's starting to move to your local officials, to your states, your cities. And this is where the real work really begins. It's now is the time to be advocating to your local officials, to your cities and states about what bike projects, what infrastructure projects are the most critical and should be prioritized with new funding that's coming. I will pass it to Patrick if you want to go over these.
Sure. Thank you, Noah. So there's a lot of exciting things in the new bill, as Noah mentioned, that are that will benefit biking and active transportation. And the first thing I want to talk about is some of the dedicated programs, some of which you're maybe very familiar with. But we're seeing some increases, in particular, to the Transportation Alternatives Program, which is experiencing about a 70% increase. It's currently set at $850 million per year, and will be set. It's a complex formula, but based on a percentage of the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, 10% of that program every year. And that program increases automatically from one year to the next. So immediately this fiscal year, we're seeing an increase to about $1.44 billion for the year. And that money should be apportioned soon. We're watching right now. We're waiting for guidance on a couple of new provisions in the program, and we're also waiting for the Federal Highway Administration to release the funds. But soon we will see that go out to the states, and hopefully that will be implemented quickly. Reauthorized, but unfortunately not increased this year, is the Recreational Trails Program. I'll make a very long story short, but the Recreational Trails Program is meant to utilize recreational vehicle, the fuel tax revenue that comes from fueling of recreational vehicles. And we know that amount is much higher than the $84 million per year. The Federal Highway Administration recently released a study in that regard, but unfortunately it was released right around the same time that this bill was passed. So the bill actually requires that Federal Highway Administration do that study. That study has already been done. And we see a potential increase in the Recreational Trails Program in the future as a result of that analysis. However, right now it's still set at $84 million per year for the length of the bill. And we're exploring ways that we might be able to get additional funding to that program. And then the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program is a new program that we, together with our partners at PeopleForBikes and other organizations, have been advocating for many, many years now. That program is dedicated funding targeted at investment in at a competitive grant basis, kind of similar to, if you're all familiar with the RAISE program, formerly known as Tiger and Build, which I'll be talking about in a little bit as well. To competitive grants that go directly to communities that are interested in building out their active transportation networks and have plans to do so, both planning grants to develop those networks and construction grants to actually build them. That program is authorized in the infrastructure bill at $200 million per year. It is not, however, appropriate. So at this point, what we are doing is working with, reaching out to appropriations committees on both chambers of Congress to make sure that that program actually receives appropriated funds. So next slide. So to talk a little bit about some of the other programs that are available. Those three programs are the dedicated programs that are for biking and active transportation. And then there's a lot of programs that for which active transportation is eligible, but are not dedicated for active transportation. So I'm going to go through those briefly, and they're fairly complex programs, and we'll take a lot of questions about them, and there's a lot of resources available online about them. Just to kind of give you the rundown. The first is the Safe Streets and Roads for All program. That program is direct grants to local governments and metropolitan planning organizations to develop and implement comprehensive safety plans designed to prevent death and serious injury on roads and streets. So it's a brand new safety program. It's funded at $5 billion over 5 years. And we understand that there will be guidance released on that fairly soon. The Biden administration really wants to get those funds out. So hopefully we'll be seeing that shortly. Another program, and let me just by way of overview, say that all these programs are really tied into specific priorities that the Biden administration has expressed. We are consistently advocating that these programs do include in their, not just include in their eligibilities, which the active transportation is eligible for, but include as their priorities that these programs really go towards active transportation networks. We know, and I know that you all understand, that connecting active transportation networks can be really effective in meeting these priority goals of the Biden administration of ensuring safety for cyclists and pedestrians, and addressing sustainability issues and climate change in particular, and also pursuing equitable economic development in communities that have historically been neglected and disinvested in. So the carbon reduction program gets to the environmental piece of that. It's targeted at a wide range of different transportation projects aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector, which is currently the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So bike and ped projects are certainly part of that. The Reconnecting Communities pilot program that provides $1 billion over 5 years to connect communities that have been divided, displaced, destroyed by infrastructure like highways, aqueducts, railways, have caused traditional, typically communities of color and low-income communities to be disrupted and destroyed and displaced. And then the RAISE grants, you all know RAISE. Historically it's been known as TIGER, and then under the Trump administration it was called the BUILD grant program. RAISE grants are funded at $1.5 billion per year as an advance appropriation in the first year, and then it's still subject to annual appropriations as it has been in the past. The recent, so the Biden administration did its first round of RAISE grants in FY21. Bicycle and pedestrian projects were very highly competitive in that about 40% of the projects of the funding actually went to projects that at least had some active transportation component. So the current RAISE grant for FY22 is open currently with a deadline in April. So many of your communities may be already working on pursuing those RAISE grants now. Safe Routes to School is a reestablishment of an old program that does not include dedicated funding for that program, but targets funding available through other programs towards Safe Routes to School. Now includes high schools as well as middle schools and elementary schools. Congestion mitigation and air quality improvement program is a long-time program that's basically continuing, but now shared micromobility is an eligible use under that program. And then the federal lands transportation program previously has been funded at $10 million. That, as it suggests, provides access, including active transportation access to federal lands. Was increased this year in the infrastructure bill from $10 million to $20 million per year. So let's go to the next slide, and then I'll turn it back to Noah.
Thanks, Patrick, for that overview. And I just want to add to, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list of programs and resources where bike infrastructure trails are eligible projects. We just wanted to highlight some of the bigger ones that are the most relevant for our audience. But please do consider getting creative if you're looking for new opportunities. There's a surface transportation block grant program. And then there might potentially be other programs if there's any movement on something like Build Back Better for large funding sources where bike projects might be eligible to reduce emissions, reconnect communities, etc. I also wanted to highlight a few other programs here that are worth looking into if your community has a big bridge project, and this does not include a bike ped specific bridge. It's just rather larger bridges under FHWA. The bridge funding program within IIJA does state that the projects must include bike ped infrastructure. So this is a great opportunity to ensure that any bridges that need help in your community, and it's likely most of them do at this point, given the number of bridges in need of maintenance, that maintenance project will include adding a sidewalk or protected bike lane, which is fantastic for helping connect bike networks. The other one I wanted to highlight is, of course, electric vehicles are a massive focus of this administration's goals to reduce emissions, and within the IIJA, there's a lot of opportunity to fund EV charging stations for the public to use. what is really important and what we're exploring at People4Bikes and with a lot of our partners in the broader transportation and EV space is how we can ensure that the deployment of public EV charging stations includes a really simple option for charging your e-bike or your e-micromobility device. Having a safe place to lock up while you charge and some simple maintenance tools connected to it like you see on bike repair stations and trails across the country. So the recent rural EV charging guidance that was released a couple weeks ago from the administration did include some sections on the importance of charging for e-bikes, bike share, e-micromobility as well. And People4Bikes is now working within the broader Charge Coalition of electrification and coming up with ways that we can ensure that new charging stations will include an option for e-bikes. Go to the next slide. Ashley, you want to take it?
Yes, hi, thank you. So I am Ashley Seward. I'm Deputy Director of State and Local Policy, and I come into play here because, as my title insinuates, I focus on state and local policy, and this is a really exciting connection between these funds and the state and local level. So putting all this together in a bow, understanding how you can get involved specifically to help with the allocation of these funds for safe and connected bike infrastructure in your town. Here are a couple of ways that you can get involved. One important way, and maybe semi-obvious, is to get involved with your local officials, planning, and politics. This is super important because programs and plans can vary from town to town, community to community. So it's important to know who's representing you, what types of project plans are coming down the pipeline, and to try and influence them in support of bike infrastructure. Another thing you can do that can also make this process a lot easier is connecting with your local, state, and local bike advocacy groups, because they're going to know who are the best persons to talk to, decision makers within your area, and how to get involved. So that is a really great resource, and we are happy to connect you with your local group if you are unsure who they are. And lastly, I'm more on the academic side, working with universities and other experts can help evaluate specific projects and the ROI for those as well. So that's another good resource to try and evaluate projects and figure out what's best next steps moving forward. So going on to the next slide, we have a couple more resources for you. We recently just launched an infrastructure funding webpage that has a lot of similar information that was shared today, but one-stop shop for you to get that information, get details about all the different funding buckets and how you can get involved. We have an action alert page tied to this. My dog is very pumped about infrastructure funding. We have an action alert page tied to this where you can quickly take action, easily take action by sending your local official a letter in support of safe and connected bike infrastructure through the allocation of these funds. So just an easy way to get involved and to send to your colleagues if you would like to spread the word as well. And lastly, but not least, we also have information from our partners at Rails-to-Trails, as well as a few other state or a few other advocacy partners. So you can get all the information, have the lay of the land, and have that as a go-to resource for you. So this is a very exciting topic. I see we have one question in the chat, but we can start rolling into that. What do we have here? Oh, maybe no question in the chat, but Kyler, is there any on the Q&A?
Yeah, there is one. Colin, thank you for your question. They said, I think we heard bridge projects will include sidewalk or protected bike lane. Does the law allow bike or ped accommodation without both?
So I can't fully answer that, but you are correct. It is, I remember reading it as or as well. We're trying to get a better sense of whether, the or is flexible. And again, this is guidance, and a lot of the rules will also depend on your state, your MPO, the entity that is carrying out this project. So this is sort of these little gray areas is where it's really important to get involved on the advocacy side if there's a specific project, and start, writing to your state DOT, your city officials, if, there's a specific project that you see that you would, like to see both bike and ped, and ideally, we're advocates of including both options. I think I just saw another question open up. Ashley, maybe this one's for you. At the state level, is there one or two departments we should engage with? I mean, your state DOT is their Department of Transportation, or whatever it's called at the state level is great. But Ashley, any other advice?
No, that's right on. That the state level DOT is going to be the best folks for you to connect with, and the transportation planners and bike and ped planners that are there, they're going to be the best ones to speak with. And again, connecting with your state and local advocacy groups, they should have those contacts to figure out who that is, and so you can get in contact with them. They'll also know if there's any other major players in that space that you should be aware of, that you can connect with to share your support for improved bike infrastructure.
And Patrick, maybe you have any insight on if, briefly, if there's any difference between connecting with a state DOT and a metropolitan planning organization, since projects can filter through those different entities sometimes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good question. It's certainly important to engage with both. If you live in an area with a metropolitan planning organization, some programs, especially some of the new programs, I mentioned the Safe Streets and Roads for All, you can be those are direct grants to MPOs and local governments. So you can engage with the MPO to apply for those directly, or your local government. The Transportation Alternatives Program, the larger MPOs of 200,000 population or more do their own competitive grant program to allocate those grants. So also important to engage with them for that purpose. Also, just in terms of getting on your state, on your regional, your metropolitan transportation plans, there are a lot of some of these programs require that you be part of the transportation improvement program. So it's important to engage with the MPO to make sure that your priority programs are on that plan. For several reasons. For some grants, it's a requirement. So definitely important to engage with both.
And lastly, I'll add as well, signing up for the newsletter for your state DOT or MPO, that could be really helpful to get the latest news and information. So just another resource to get the information coming to you in real time.
And yeah, we have a question that I love from Rachel. Rachel, hello. Thank you so much for joining. How can we support PeopleForBikes efforts to get funds appropriated for the Alternative Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program?
A great question. We will have some more resources coming soon to specifically target folks in the appropriations committees in the House and Senate as this process gets moving. But if you were involved in this effort last year just to get the active transportation infrastructure investment program included in the infrastructure bill and the multiple drafts of an infrastructure bill, get ready to start sending some letters like the ones you helped us with last year, and I'm sure helped with Rails-to-Trails too. We worked really closely on getting this included again in the multiple versions of the infrastructure bill that were introduced in various committees. And so it'll be probably a similar looking effort and just targeted to appropriators. If you know that you live in a district or in a state with a member of Congress who sits on an appropriations committee, your comments are going to be even more valuable. So just stay tuned. Make sure you're on our email list and Rails-to-Trails Conservancy so that the second there's an opportunity to engage, we're giving you something. Patrick, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just add, we're going to need every member of Congress who is on an appropriations committee, not necessarily, so there's the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development subcommittees, which are the most important, but any appropriators are going to be important. We're working on putting together some dear colleague letters that we're going to have need some broad sign on to the appropriators to ask them to fully fund the program. And one thing I mentioned is that it's authorized in the infrastructure bill at $200 million. But we would ideally like, and the appropriated amount isn't limited to that. The bill that we got introduced last year funded the program at $500 million, which is, we think, more appropriate to meet the demand. So that's what we're going to be asking for appropriators to fund the program at. So we're going to need everybody on board to really make that push.
We have one question that came in, I think probably on the minds of many people on this call. Someone anonymously asks, is there any mechanism for a private business to access these funds?
So for the most part, I think that the answer is no. You will see, if you look through the details of some of the programs, they'll identify, to whom or to which entities are eligible to receive the funds and to do these projects. I think that there are a few with nonprofits or like local organizations as the eligible recipients, just given that they're usually very highly involved with what the community needs and wants. But I don't know that in any program necessarily extends to like a private business or a company. Patrick, do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, you're generally correct, Noah. Some of the programs there are some programs that are available to nonprofit organizations, but not for-profit businesses. One example is the Safe Routes to School, and some of the safety funds can be dedicated to nonprofit organizations. But generally for infrastructure-related projects, those are grants for local governments. I would encourage you to engage with your local governments again too, just to see if they are looking to contract out for some of these projects. But in terms of direct grants to private organizations, for for-profit business especially, it's very limited.
Thanks, Patrick.
Well, yeah, we'll probably have time for one more question in our final minute. I'll make sure that all of our panelists' contact information is up on the slide, so you can follow up with any of them. And we'll give it a few seconds, see if any last question comes in. But Noah, Patrick, Ashley, thank you so much for bringing your expertise today, and everyone for your questions. Please look out for our recording and slide resources shortly after the call.
Great. Thank you.
All right, see you none. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Glad to be here. Have a good day, everyone.